everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to today's press briefing about the housing crisis in New Jersey. My name is Cassandra Etienne, Associate Director of Programming and Membership at the Center for Cooperative Media. So we're here to talk about housing inequality. It's really hit many New Jersey communities hard, and in recent years, an unstable job market, inflation, and increasing costs of living have made residents that much more vulnerable to eviction, foreclosure, and homelessness. People of color and those residing in low-income communities are also hardest hit by soaring rent and home sale prices, in addition to redlining and predatory lending practices that put home ownership out of reach. And to help us parse through these issues and how they're covered in the media, we're pleased to welcome our distinguished panel. And I'll start with our host, Schlonn Hawkins, Chief Executive Officer and Publisher of Shelterforce. We're also joined by Kelvin Bodie, Director of Healthy Homes and Communities at Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey, as well as Professor John Robinson III, Associate Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. For some who may not have been to these events before, this event is part of our Not Your Same Old Sources series. It features experts from our diverse sources database, which is a publicly available sortable list of experts of different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities, in an effort to get journalists to diversify their Rolodexes and to reach out to sources that reflect the diversity of New Jersey's communities. This panel is presented in partnership with, this panel is funded by the Center for Cooperative Media in partnership with NJ.com and New Jersey Ethnic and Community Media. Lastly, I should note that today's event is being recorded and we'll have time at the end, at the hour, about the last 20 minutes or so for questions. So please raise your hands or drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to your question during our time together this afternoon. Thanks again, and now I'll turn it over to our host, Schlonn Hawkins.
Hello, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday. As Cassandra said, my name is Schlonn Hawkins. I am the CEO and publisher of Shelterforce, and Shelterforce is a national publication, but our roots are in New Jersey. We started in New Jersey. A newsletter, actually, a printed newsletter with New Jersey tenant advocates. And so we have grown to this robust platform where we talk about all things affordable housing and community development. And I'm just excited to be with you all today to hopefully host a very good conversation with these two lovely gentlemen that are with us today. I hope that everyone views this time as time well spent and that you walk away with some information and hopefully some new resources and new friends. So I will not belabor any longer. I'm the type of person that want to dive in. And so I am going to ask both of these gentlemen to introduce themselves. And let's start with Kelvin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kelvin Bodie. I'm the Director of Healthy Homes and Communities at the Housing and Community Development Network of New Jersey. I'll just call it the network from here on out for the sake of my time. But what we do at the network, we're a mix of nonprofit advocacy, direct technical assistance for our members, and political advocacy on multiple levels. That's supposed to be a bit redundant. But we're a nonprofit network across the state. Generally, our focus is twofold. It's developing and supporting policy for affordable housing while also offering direct technical assistance to our members that can kind of help them tangible on-the-ground community development projects like seen through. Without getting too deep into the weeds, the side of what my work generally is advocating for policies and successful funding and action strategies that can get on-the-ground community members funding, organized, and actual tangible results. A big one that I'll probably dive into a little bit later is working with all aspects of the community, such as longtime residents, stakeholders, anchor institutions, the police department, other powers that be in residence to kind of create a more organic, sustainable plan for change.
Thank you. Professor John?
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to say thank you to Cassandra and Mariella for organizing this event. And it's a real pleasure to be here with you, Schlonn, and you, Kelvin, on this panel. I'm a professor of sociology, and most of my work is on housing and urban inequality, and it focuses on explaining the historical roots and drivers of the affordable housing crisis. And so I know that we'll talk about that today, but a lot of my work is on that. A lot of it has focused in particular on the marginalization of renters and of renting communities. We have lots of, and that includes, as you can imagine, a lot of communities of color where the number of renters are uh, much higher than relative to other communities, and so these communities have particular needs, and renters have a particular history of being disinvested and being excluded, and so and so a lot of my work looks at that. My current book looks at the history and politics of corporate investment in affordable housing, and it really kind of it sort of explains the invention of what we call affordable housing today. And I know affordable housing is this word that many of us may understandably roll our eyes at because we know that affordable housing, there's never enough of it. We know that it's often not affordable enough. And so the book is really kind of explaining sort of the history and politics of why affordable housing really is so insufficient today. But thank you for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Yes. And so, John, you affectionately talked about the word affordable and folks' reaction and the rolling of the eye, right? So that definitely is a great segue into what I wanted to talk with you both about, which is about narratives and how we are talking about housing and the housing crisis. So I would love to know, what are your thoughts on how we are addressing the housing crisis? I mean, you could start right with the affordable housing and what that means to some folks and why we should or shouldn't use it. Or you could talk about any other terminology that is getting your goat right now, because the important thing about having dialogue and narrative is being able to effectively talk to folks to get to change. And so we want to be very cognizant of that. We want to be respectful of that. So please, gentlemen, jump in.
Sure. Yeah. So really with the narrative on how we're kind of the affordable housing piece itself, I would say that the work that we've kind of seen, and it's been to our benefit, is that if you went a generation or two back and you said the word public housing or affordable housing or public infrastructure or transport, like John was saying, there was kind of, you get like the upper lip starts to snarl, the eyes start to roll, the NIMBYs come out in force. And we've definitely seen in the last couple of years, really just since the price of living is going up and the pandemic and a whole bunch of other factors, everyone is really starting to feel the bottom line rising as far as rent and what they're paying to have, decent, safe, and affordable shelter. And so I'm happy to see that the narrative as far as affordable housing across the board is really being picked up publicly. And I think we're seeing newfound political will behind it. But we need to also remember that as this political will is coming out, there needs to be equity in how we're addressing neighborhoods that, while some are becoming underserved because the rent is rising, they don't have advocacy and the infrastructure is aging. There are other communities that have, a generational legacy of dealing with that going back nearly a century. And so, without sitting there picking and choosing specific examples on the map for New Jersey, I would say that, as we're seeing newfound political wind in these sails for addressing the fact that, the rent is too darn high, just to be polite about it, but addressing the fact that there are populations that have historically seen a much greater need for this, and not to forget about them as we kind of just broadly start to talk about this subject on a state and national level.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on Kelvin's point. When I think, I don't know how this fits into the question of framing specifically, but one thing that came to mind to me is that there's so much that needs to be revealed, and I think that just kind of remembering that so much of what affects us is not obvious. It isn't obvious to folks who it isn't even obvious to me, and I get paid to kind of dig into, to look at stuff, but it's certainly not obvious to folks who have a job and who have, maybe several jobs and who have lots of responsibilities. So, Schlonn, I even think of your publication, Shelterforce, which I'm an avid reader, and I would encourage folks to read it. But you all did a really fantastic series recently on the low income housing tax credit, and many folks don't know, but this has replaced, the stuff that we know about, like public housing, Section 8, all that type of stuff. The low-income housing, to the extent that we have affordable housing, usually this policy is involved, but most people don't know about. And LIHTC. Thank you, Joe. There's a abbreviation for it called LIHTC. But my point is that this is something that's very crucial to how the housing market works and to the supply of affordable housing and to these questions that we're kind of grappling with today. But most people don't know about it. They don't even know that it even exists. And so I think that Shelterforce did a real service, I think, in just kind of laying out through a series of articles, just how this thing works, what's happening, what are the stakes, who's all involved, and so on and so forth. So I think that kind of goes back to this point of how much there still is to be revealed, and how that's a part of the framing conversation, that there's so much that is not obvious, that flies under the radar, sometimes intentionally so. Sometimes people are really invested in us not knowing certain things. And so just kind of buying into that spirit of revealing things, I think, is a really important thing. The other thing that I will mention here in terms of framing is we're in a time, and I think Kelvin kind of spoke to this to some degree, we're in a time where people are openly talking about alternatives. And I think it's an important framing consideration is to always make it clear that alternatives are possible. Alternatives are not just pie in the sky; they are possible. And so I think that that's something that is maybe won't be obvious to some people. But like alternatives exist, and I use the example of suburban home ownership. There was one point in time when nobody could own a home, except for people who were very rich. And between 1930 and 1960, the American federal government created home ownership, almost this model of suburban home ownership, almost out of the thin air. And so you can imagine all of the resources that went into that. One quote says that it took the same amount of resources that it would require to clear the wilderness in the American West. And so when you think about that, and then when we bring that to the conversations that we have about affordable housing, about what is possible, it's a reminder that we need to aim high and to not be sort of put off by this idea that alternatives are not possible or are unrealistic. And so that's what I'll say.
I could very briefly add as well, when we're kind of framing those alternatives and those solutions that are possible, really a key part of that narrative is going to be who are driving those solutions and who's at the table for them. Because we have seen a legacy of, I can speak at least personally to the work that we do in communities for crime prevention and quality of life improvement. There's often a mentality around housing, community development, safety, and health that if you're not an expert, stay in your lane, you don't really have the qualifications to speak on this. And all that ends up doing is breeding apathy among the residents that, might have wanted to get involved in the beginning, but after decades and years and years and years of being told, well, you're not qualified to have a seat at the table for the solution. It just, if the legacy is one of them being underserved, the legacy of the solution also can't be of them being locked away from the decision-making process either. That's not going to be empowerment, at least sustainably.
I love that you said that, Kelvin, because what we found is during the pandemic, even though folks were not invited to the table, they were creating their own table out of necessity. And so I think that, I can speak for Shelterforce. One of the things that we want to be able to do is make sure that the information is accessible and digestible in a way that invites multiple people, an array of people, to take that information and to do something with it. So I really appreciate that. So moving on to our next topic, which is a topic that I love, which is around collaboration. Coming from a nonprofit background, but also running a nonprofit news organization, there is nothing that we can do alone. And working in the community, we know that we can't do it alone. We will be fooling ourselves if we continue to work in silos. And so can you all share about any ideas or experiences that you have on collaboration that lends to addressing the housing crisis?
Yeah, I can open up quickly, which is two examples that we definitely see in our work is so I'll just fall back very quickly on the crime prevention and quality of life improvement. We are well and truly, I think we're all pretty much on the same page within this call and the audiences as well, that just kind of working solely through the police department for crime prevention, it does not work. It might get some of your numbers down on hardcore stuff, but then it's going to come at a price that just has to get paid later on in the form of basically your residents not trusting the local institutions, which is its own form of erosion. So, as a quick example for that, we've had cases where the business owners, the residents, and the police are all complaining about different things happening on Main Street. And then you realize they're all really kind of trying to get to the same goal, but like perhaps the business owner has to do their part in getting some more lighting on the street. The police maybe have to start walking around and not just driving and being seen, having a relationship with the community. And maybe the residents need to be educated on what rights they have when calling in something to 911 or the police department. They don't have to identify themselves. They don't have to do, certain things, even if they're pressured by dispatch. And so, that's one example. But then for the housing piece, we've seen developers come into cities and pretty much knock down an old home or an old building that has some kind of historic value or cultural value to the residents. And they build a brand new condo high rise. And nobody wants to move into it because the residents hate the building. And that extends to some of the people moving in because they were never brought to the table about what do you want to see this building. Land is we're a small world and it's a smaller state. Land is a very precious resource, especially in our urban centers. And so when communities are losing that resource and they don't get even a small say in what that space could become or what it could be, and they're expected to support it, frequent that place and help kind of integrate it into the larger scene, that's impossible if you're not going to have them actually making some decisions at the table when that development is taking place. So I'll just give a quick shout out. If there are any developers in the audience or anybody that is working with developers, community benefits agreements, like push as hardcore for them as you can. If you can get in writing between yourself, the municipality, and the developer that they'll add such and such units of affordable housing, or they'll do such and such amount of development as a price for putting the business in your area, that's like everyone wins, at least ideally. But that's my shameless plug for CBAs. If you take anything out of what I just said, community benefits agreements, please.
Nice, thank you, Kelvin. Yeah, it's really fascinating to hear that from you, Kelvin, because community benefits agreements is something that I've heard about from a lot of folks, and so it's great to hear that it is working in your case. So, I mean, I guess one example that came to mind for me is, I've been on the board of a legal defense agency in St. Louis called the Arch City Defenders. And this is a nonprofit that represents a lot of lower income people. They have sued police departments that have abused people, lots of different people. And so this is a group that serves a lot of lower income communities, but mostly on the legal side and mostly in their encounters with law enforcement. But one of the things that I really learned through working with this organization is how much that work brings them into the housing world. Like they end up having to do so much on housing, and they end up having to represent folks against their landlords. They end up having to the cases that go to court end up having a lot to do with where folks live, and and so on and so forth. So it struck me that was one of the things that was really eye-opening, because on the face of it, the organization has nothing to do with housing stuff, but the practical reality is that they are always involved in the housing issues that their clients are facing. And so it's a bit of a tangent, but it reminded me of this question about collaboration, because what it taught me, which is probably something that is very obvious to lots of you, is that there are these hidden opportunities for collaboration among organizations, that even organizations that may not be doing explicitly housing related things, they're very involved often with housing, because housing is so central to the lives of people. And so that's what I've learned from it. But like I said, this is to me, a conversation that I love to learn a lot more from. And so I get a lot from this conversation. I would be interested in hearing you all's experiences.
If I can just add, I'm like really glad you said the part about like organizations you don't traditionally think of as being in your wheelhouse. It's very anecdotal, but over the pandemic, one of the biggest sources of information for like, wow, we need to get this information out about the housing conditions were teachers, because they were doing remote learning with students and actually seeing the buildings that they were living in, the rooms that they were inhabiting. And so it was actually a lot of public schools and teachers that started to go, actually, hey, we might not traditionally be within this wheelhouse, but like there is a very serious point being made over here. And so, yeah, there's often groups that you might not even think of as traditionally like in the home, that because of some periphery or because of some part of the job, they are in the home to a degree.
Right.
Yeah, I love that you said that, Calvin. And also, John, is that I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, but everything that we do intersects with housing. So, if you have an idea, or like you said, being able to get that information out through teachers, I just think that we should be innovative and creative, and have such a drive and tenacity to get to the solution, the end goal at mind, which is thriving communities and people having a safe place to live and reside, affordable, safe place to reside. You should try it. Don't allow things to get in the way. That's something I tell my staff all the time is, let's not get in the way. Let someone else decide whether or not they want to partner or not, but let's just try it. And we'll be surprised of the outcome. So thank you for that. So, Kelvin, you gave a little bit of a story of, you called it anecdotal, but I do believe that stories like that are the very thing that connect us. And so I'd like for us to talk a little bit about storytelling. And we have folks from all different parts and components of the media. And to your point, there's different ways that we can get the information out. But my whole thing is that storytelling is literally, I think, like the linchpin, or sort of like that centerpiece that allows folks to connect, and can lead to change. And so, is there anything in your travels or in your work that you've seen, and that you can give examples of the power of storytelling and how it's actually changed things for the better as it relates to the housing crisis?
Yeah, so for like the two that I can think of off the top of my head is climate change, and then another one would be like indoor pollutants like lead exposure. It's very easy, especially with the healthy homes kind of side of things where I work, to you get a lot of reports out from institutions, a lot of reports from analysts, and the numbers, if you understand the numbers, are stunning. But for the average person, and I'm not even claiming to be well versed in some of that stuff once it gets into like graphs inside of graphs, but like, if you're the average person who you're working a 9 to 5, you have kids to take care of, you're not going to sit down for 2 to 3 hours a night and pour over a top university publication on what such and such numbers are. And so, where we saw extreme success, at least in getting people outside of our spheres mobilized for like lead exposure and like climate change, was actually having people show up in front of them and tell their stories. It's really easy to kind of just think of these as abstract issues that don't involve people. Like when we talk about climate change destroying housing, for some reason we don't talk about the residents in that headline
Right.
or the tenants that are going to have to get moved. We just talk about the buildings getting destroyed.
Right.
And yeah, in that sense, and I don't think people do it maliciously or anything, but I think if you just hear that enough, oh, the buildings, the roads, the sidewalks, the people become an afterthought or not a thought at all. And so that's kind of where we've really had a lot of success in just having kind of people describe what their trials and tribulations were. And in the case of lead exposure itself, it was actually having moms with their children come to the state house and go like, no, this is my child. This is me. Are you really going to tell me to my face that I don't deserve a safe and healthy place to live? And unless you got like Kool-Aid for blood, as my friend would say, or like Andy for blood, you are not going to look someone in the eye with their kid and tell them, yeah, you don't deserve that.
Right. Yeah, no, I actually hear a lot of our community organizers and practitioners, when they are advocating, bringing the folks that whatever decision is being made in legislative hall or policy, they're bringing the folks from the community and having them speak on behalf. It really I can go down a whole tangent here, but I will not. So I'll turn it over to you, Professor John.
Yeah, and yeah, I have comments that really align with your thoughts because so I'm thinking of some of the work that I've done on around home repair, elderly folks who live in homes that are often unsafe physically for them and that have a lot of problems, but there's very little resources around and aid around to get these repairs that are needed. And so we've in St. Louis made some progress in sort of getting the local policymakers to pay attention to this issue there. And the stories were a big part of that. And so, like, for example, we did a survey, 2 surveys, in fact, but we also did interviews. And we found out that in our conversations with the policymakers, the stuff from the interviews really kind of stood out even more than the surveys, than the numbers. And this kind of gets to a point that Kelvin just made. And it's because, when you talk about somebody is cost burden, meaning that they are not getting, they're paying a lot on their homes relative to the income that they get, that may just not really connect with someone. But when you hear from some of the elderly folks that they are not able to pay for medicine, and that they are not able to bring in groceries and so on and so forth. When you hear about the problems in their home and the way that they have to maybe avoid the living room because because the living room has a draft in it and the window isn't fixed, and so they have to now navigate the stairs, and navigating the stairs is really dangerous for them. Is that type of stuff that I think doesn't really come out in the numbers, but really conveys the sense of how tragic these problems actually are, and sort of to Schlonn's point, it really encourages us to connect with that, and so that really has been my experience as well.
And so with the folks that are on the line, what would you say would be the best approach for journalists and newsrooms and content creators? And I know some of you like content creators. What does that mean? Or why are we including them? And I'll elaborate a little bit later. But how can we do a better job of telling the story?
So personally, for me, being in New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ida, I will not claim to have been in the trenches on it, as some people were. But what I will say is that the media has a really, and I don't know if it's for the sake of brevity or because it's just more punchy, they have a really bad tendency to show you the disaster after it happened, Main Street already wrecked or the car already up the tree. And what they don't show you is Main Street a month ago when it was having a parade with all of the residents on it, shopping at the businesses, interacting with each other. So it really, I don't think it really conveys that what's at stake when you're just kind of showing the result afterwards and the smoke kind of going up in the air. Because it's like, okay, I don't really know what came before. So what's the stakes here? What's at risk? And then so I really think putting that element to it, and I would even say with the affordable housing, and I'm borrowing this a little bit from some of the great speakers that I've had at the conference here that I'm at in DC, but we have a tendency to think that financial struggle and housing insecurity has a face or a look to it. And we've reached a point where just about everyone is paying 50% or more on rent. We've reached the average, salary in New Jersey without getting to it is not enough for those kind of conditions. And so I think when the media and journalists and that kind of public eye just focuses on after you've tripped and fallen over and your face down on the floor, it's really easy to have perceptions or say, oh, well, of course they wound up there and this isn't a problem really to be considered by us because that couldn't happen to us. But then suddenly when the segment or the whatever it is opens up and shows that no, this was a successful person going to college, had a kid in their own place, and maybe it was one medical incident or like a car accident or just some curveball that set them back. That really, I think, kind of brings people together and realizing, oh, I'm not above this in the way I thought I was. But when it's just that, yeah, post disaster, here's the shot of the smoke going up in the air and the person homeless. It's, oh, that couldn't happen to me.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I would just add that I really love this idea about storytelling and the power of storytelling, as a way to connect. I was just sort of at the point that there are many types of stories that we can tell, and I'm a fan of journalism, and so I'm not really standing in the shoes of like telling journalists how you can do your job better, I could tell as a reader, I really love different kinds of stories, and stories are not just only about this is Adam, this is what he went through. Stories are sometimes about this is kind of this is the situation. So, for example, I think of following the money as a way of telling the story about what's happening. Sometimes, the money is not always apparent. Those relationships are not always apparent, and so we can tell stories by following the money. I think of another way, another theme that stands out to me is accountability. Like how do we convey and parse accountability in our stories? And so, for example, we live in a time where a lot of big banks and big corporations are making investments in affordable housing. But how do we make sense of those investments and without having a broader sense of accountability of what banks actually owe communities? Those investments may be very like a drop in the bucket relative to what these big financial institutions actually owe, given the history of disinvestment, given the history, given all that they benefit from through our taxes and so on and so forth. And so, like, I think that as we tell stories, we can also help people to understand these kind of this notion of accountability and how these large institutions are accountable to us and should be held accountable. Those are kind of the things that come to mind when I think of storytelling.
And I really just what you said with the media, I have to jump in. I'm a history guy, and like the media, you guys are in a really special position. I was really just cheerleading whole like show the beginning of the story, the middle, and the end. Don't just show the end. You have a real opportunity. You have access to so much information as far as the area's history, where the money has gone, who the movers and shakers are, and I don't want to give too many examples, but we did have Elizabeth up in North New Jersey when Hurricane Ida went through. I believe there were 5 or 6 deaths in the city, and almost all of them are in the first floor of an affordable housing complex that was a known risk since the 70s. And you can actually find the newspaper reports going back to the 70s about how this area floods terribly. And so y'all are in a really special position as the media to kind of draw a consistent linear thread to tell the story with us. And you actually have the access to the information as well. So don't be shy.
I love that. And I agree. I think that when I love the word accountability, that is something that we actually inserted into our mission going forward. We modified our mission, holding folks accountable through the information, I think is important. And so being able to circle back. So to your point, Kelvin, not just telling the beginning, but being able to tell the beginning, the middle, and the end, and then circling back to say, okay, how did it go? How did it perform? What happened, after that unfortunate situation happened? What's going on with this new policy? Is it really benefiting the people? What are the people saying about this? Being able to circle back and really follow it, to your point, so that there is a thread and so people can have access at multiple points of the story, right? And I do think that doing that, even though it's not easy, and given the time that we're in and the backlash that folks are experiencing, and so, but it's important to give that common thread and to continue the conversation, so folks have the information to actually advocate for themselves or to be more informed to make a decision. That's what democracy is, supposedly, right?
Right.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question, Schlonn?
Hopefully I have an answer.
Yeah, well, and it's just because I'm just curious because Shelterforce is a publication. So, have you all changed the way you approach storytelling over your time there?
I would say in the last couple of years, when I joined the organization, I am a communication. That's been my life for decades, right? Believe it or not. But I also am a consumer of information. So I love consuming information. But one of the things that we realized is that, especially during the pandemic, folks were in lockstep with the information that we were putting out, because people needed to know what's going on, what are the resources, what do I have at my fingertips, how can I do, those sorts of things. And so we saw the volume, if you will, rise. And so, but what we realized is that the way that we were doing it before doesn't meet the needs of everyone, right? So like I said earlier, people were not connected to a particular organization to advocate professionally, if you will, or part of a community development organization. They were just coming together out of a need, right? And so how do we reach those individuals? And so it's not going to take the 1,500 word story all the time or article. It's going to take a video. It is going to take a video of what is gentrification. I see it happening, but I don't know what it is. And so it's going to take 5 minutes or 3 minutes of a video. And it's also a way to start a conversation. And then also to being able to circle the block, if you will. So being able to see and to show what the progress has been. It's not good enough to just say, this is what happened in X community, but it's like, okay, well, really, how's it going? How's it doing? Because a lot of times people come to Shelterforce to see what's going on in different communities. What's the breakdown? What's the solution over there? Maybe I can apply it here. But we want to know, like, how long did that solution last? Is it still lasted? Is it still thriving? Did you make any pivots? Those sorts of things. So I say all that to say that, yes, we had to change how we are, reporting. We're also added audio. And this is out of convenience. So you can be in your car, and digesting the information. Or you could be folding laundry, you could be doing dishes, whatever the case may be, wherever you are is really sort of my motto. We want to meet you there. And so that's just different ways. So yes, we've definitely had to change. And is it always easy? Change is not always easy, right? But someone has to do it and someone has to try. And you may not get it right all the time, the first time, but you can always quickly pivot. I think that people are in such a place of like a need for change. And I hate keep saying change because it sounds kind of cliche. And I'm not running for office, or like, this is not like a public service announcement or anything like that. But people are in such a need for change, but ownership of that change. I want to have a stake. I want to have a seat at the table. I want to have something to contribute. I see my community changing. I was in DC, and then I'll move us on. I was in DC at the National Fair Housing Alliance conference 2 years ago. And I had an individual come to me and say that she literally changed her profession to go into housing during the pandemic. And so what had happened was there was I can't remember where, but there was some natural disaster that happened in her community. And the next day, while people were gathering their items, whatever was left, there were developers that were out with their clipboards inviting folks to, giving a check. And she was so like, what do I do? Like, this feels wrong, but I don't know what this is called. I don't know what to do. I don't, And she literally changed her profession to go into housing to learn how to benefit her community. And so that's what I mean by people are in such a place of ownership and wanting to, lend some sort of help or resolution, to their communities that they grew up in, that they, so. Okay. Anything else to add before I move us on?
I just wanted to briefly say just the follow-up is incredibly important because in the policy world, there's a danger of, fairy tales go, and then they all lived happily ever after, or the end. And yeah, there's a real danger from a policy perspective to go, well, there's a lot of parts of the state that I don't necessarily interact or deal with on my day to day. But we'll sign a bill on the dotted line, pat ourselves on the back, and say we did it. We saved the town. Well, no, if the town was redlined or the town has a food desert, you signing a bill didn't just get a supermarket into that town. It didn't just get people actually housed in homes that are properly valued and not undervalued, historic things of that nature. So I don't want to go on a tangent like I tend to, but that really just kind of hit a spark with me.
I know we have a few minutes and we're going to open it up for questions. But this is just me. I'm curious as to know what you guys think. Especially in New Jersey, we see a lot of a few, but prominent folks that are celebrity status that are coming back to the community and building affordable housing or partnering with developers to build affordable housing. I'm just curious as to what are your thoughts on that?
I've gone first a lot, so I don't know if John wants to go first.
Okay. So I think that it's and so without speaking about the specific examples, because I'm not sure about the specific examples, but I'll say just in general, I think of it as sort of a mixed thing, because on the one hand, it's always good when someone is contributing money to it. Now, we can as many of you know, in our version of capitalism, it's very easy to imagine, low-income housing being completely forgotten, no money whatsoever, whether it's from the public or the private sector. Mm-hmm. So really, any type of investment is meaningful in a world like that. And so that's one thing. On the other hand, I would just feel an urge to put it into perspective, because one thing that I know from studying this is that I think we're over reliant on those type of investments, and I hesitate to call them charitable, because sometimes they're getting really big tax benefits in exchange for that. But I think just as a society, I don't think it's a good thing that we are reliant on these types of investments that could be very showy and could be very good public relations for any given celebrity. But is it the solution to the affordable housing crisis that we need? Like, does it actually replace having real stable, robust programs and programs of assistance? In our society, it has actually replaced that, and I think that's the issue. But I think it's a good thing if you don't look at that context. But within that context, I think that's the problematic part of it.
Definitely in agreement on more things than not there, because it's I'm never going to trash anybody for coming back to their hometown and out of their own pocket helping to develop affordable housing. But unless every Jersey town is going to shoot out the next Bon Jovi or Springsteen, you can't, like John was saying, you can't rely on that as the across the board model. No, I wouldn't trash anyone for going back to their own town and helping to develop affordable housing. And I think it does give a degree of flexibility that when you're kind of going through traditional state avenues, oftentimes the land that affordable housing ends up being given is the kind of bottom of the barrel, the last area the town really wants to develop on. So I will say with that, at least they can leverage a little more funding to the table in specific instances and maybe get better land, better equipment, better stuff than might normally be sourced. But like John was saying, that's not an across the board model.
Good points. Appreciate that. All right. So final thoughts. Any thoughts around the housing crisis in New Jersey, key aspects that folks should be paying attention to? And it doesn't necessarily have to be New Jersey, but we definitely want to, talk about New Jersey. But, if there's anything that folks or insights that we want to leave folks with, please now share them.
Yeah, I'll say for New Jersey in particular, we have a very, very receptive governor right now and a very receptive legislation to affordable housing. This was not always the case. I came onto the job when the Christie administration was in full swing, and that was a real uphill climb, just to say the least. I could use more words on that, but what I would say is we're probably in the best position in my lifetime that I've been in as far as putting pressure on our legislators and our leaders to really put money into this. Um, we're also coming off of what was probably one of the most cash rich times for the state's budget. That is starting to contract now that the COVID dollars are going. But but a lot of the programs that were funded from those COVID dollars and a lot of the goodwill that was there from that, it's really going to be up to us as advocates and organizers and the residents that we serve to keep that pressure on our legislators to say, no, actually, that program really saved lives when it was around, or that program really kept our community together. And while you might not have the money coming from Washington to do it, maybe you should start figuring out where else we can find that. And so I'd really just say, like, continue the goodwill that we have really behind our sales from COVID and from coming out of the pandemic, where we acknowledge the need across the board and just not letting this become a flash in the pan.
Mm.
Yeah, I'll be really brief on this one because I am still learning about Jersey's specific sort of angle on these problems. I know that in some ways Jersey is just like so many other states, and so I saw that last year 141,000 people applied to the Section 8 wait list. And there were only 20,000 spots. And so that just kind of, just think of the level of need that exists where that many people are applying to the wait list. And there are just only a fraction of spots actually open for that. So, but that is also true in so many other cities. Another thing about something about Jersey that I would say raises questions for me is that I know that Jersey has been sort of a leader in inclusionary housing. And so that just raises a question for me is like, how has that been limited and why has that not done more to actually, fix the housing situation? And I can't say I have the answer for that, but it's just like one of the questions that is raised for me. But yeah.
I can actually speak it's very broadly, and I'm sure I can get G-checked by someone who knows a little more. Townships and municipalities actually do usually have an obligation to build a certain amount of affordable housing. That's actually been in law for, I think, since the 80s now. But what's really kind of hamstrung it is that, well, I don't want to play their narrative here, but what the narrative was that, well, yeah, it's a legal obligation. By the time we get down the checklist to it, we're out of money. And so, yeah, and the COVID, what Governor Murphy did a year or two back, I'm really fuzzy on the date for this one, but he basically forced a bunch of money through into the townships and the counties saying, no, you have the money now. This is specifically earmarked for the development of your affordable housing obligations. Get to it.
Wow. Interesting. Very clear.
With Jersey, what I will say just very briefly personally is I have a real sticking point of affordable housing can't just be something that's located in the boons or in the cities. There should be affordable housing in the shore towns. There should be affordable housing close to the cities and the transit hubs. There are parts of New Jersey that are traditionally seen as for certain types of people and not for others.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
We have some questions in the chat.
So I have to say we should go ahead and get to those questions.
All right. This has been fantastic, and I could listen to you three talk about this for much longer. We do have 2 questions in the chat, and then I have one as well if we have time. Mariela wants to know, how can people from communities whose primary language is not English get important information that they need about housing? Is there enough information out there for them? And if so, where can they get it? If not, what can we do about it as members of the media and content creators and so forth to rectify that?
Yeah, I guess very briefly, Jersey is one of the most New Jersey. Sorry, I shouldn't say Jersey. I'm flexing my my hometown.
We'll allow it. We'll allow it.
There we go. Yeah, nobody's getting it confused with the island. So, but we're one of the most diverse states in the union, and so it often is the case that there are hundreds of enclaves out there that that might not be on the radar necessarily. So if there's community organizations that are available to kind of be like, I don't want to say like a median or something, but it's often for those communities, those like smaller groups working directly with a nonprofit, a community development corporation that has a relationship with the municipality, so that you're not just showing up to city hall or town hall, starting that relationship over from scratch. There are usually some types of organizations that if they don't have those materials on hand, it is in their mission statement to get it, especially if the need is there from communities such as that.
John, did you want to add to that, or is that Or do you want to go?
You know, this is something that I want to be better educated on myself, I will say. So, yeah, I'm going to defer to Kelvin and maybe Schlonn on this one.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Calvin.
No, the only brief aside I was going to give is that it's often in our personal experience much easier to work with a trusted resident within that community or that group as opposed to if you're trying to teach the whole community in like a giant group setting, that's going to be herding cats really difficult. But if you get one or two really respected community leaders or well-trusted residents and they kind of serve as the messenger slash that, well, hey, I can actually help break it down, and actually me helping break it down is going to be a really, really good sign of compromise or sign of collaboration.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that as a media organization, I think it's just really important. Partnership is one of our pillars, and I think partnering with the community-based organizations or residents, I think that could be sort of like in my former role, we used to call them neighborhood captains or block captains, right? That you form those types of relationships to help to funnel that information, but also too, I know for us, we're looking at exploring multiple languages with our information. But that's just something that's in the works. But I think it's something that's definitely necessary. But also too, when we talk about partnering with other newsrooms that are language focused, like if it's for me in Delaware, it's OI Delaware, or something like that you can partner with to help work to get the information out to the different communities.
Yeah, and as a media org, you also have the ability just to the major cities around the state, just give a quick call to the organizations there and just ask quickly, are there new populations that you're dealing with? And they'll be thrilled that you're coming to them as a source of local information.
Anthony Avincula wants to know, while New Jersey ranks 5th lowest for violent crime and 4th lowest for property crime, it's becoming increasingly common to experience challenges associated with a criminal record, especially when it comes to finding affordable and decent housing. As advocates, can you speak to what you do to resolve this?
The ban the box bill would be a big one in New Jersey. Just as for the uninitiated, it was essentially saying outside of really egregious crimes that are dealing with like stuff that you should be basically buried under the prison for, that you really should not have your prospects at applying for an apartment or a home denied because of something that's on your criminal record that wasn't one of those like egregious things that they everyone agreed on. And it just more stuff like that because we know that offenders are more likely to become repeat offenders if they aren't given early intervention. And so this is one of those cases that if you really do want to get that population rehabilitated in a healthy, sustainable way, you actually have to, if we're going off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they need shelter. If they don't have that, then, everything else is going to go off the rails.
Right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah, the only other thing that I would add to this is that this is sort of a step removed, but regulating who gets to be a landlord, because there are these increasingly there are these huge companies that buy up a lot of the properties, and they're more likely to use these kind of digitized services that immediately exclude people who have records and so on and so forth. And so like there's a way that one avenue of addressing that might be to kind of better regulate something that we do very rarely or not at all in this country, regulate how people actually become landlords and what they are able to do in that.
It's a really good point. It seems a little silly when you think about some of the hoops people have to jump through just to, sell ice cream versus, scalp housing and resell it to people. I have a question, and we have about 5 minutes left. So while I am filling that time with my question, please feel free to drop yours in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to ask yours. Schlonn, you'd mentioned a little bit earlier about some of the interesting insights that have come from sectors or people who are not directly related to housing, but still encounter it in some ways. And I've seen a million of these kind of stories and articles with regard to how the media covers these issues. I think there was one I'm going to put in the chat about how New Jersey City, I think it was Newark, gave residents $400 a month, no strings attached. And study after study after study after study shows the same result every time. People spend that money on housing, food, childcare, the kinds of basic Maslowian needs that are at the bottom of that pyramid. What kind of momentum or what kind of action is going on around those kind of programs and tying them to housing? And as a side note, as sort of a pet peeve of my own, how can we get, how can media better cover these studies and stories so that it's not just like, wow, the same thing happened again and again. Oh my gosh, this seems to work, and push for actual substantive implementation of these kinds of things with regard to both housing and basic decency and dignity.
Mhm.
Oh, that was loaded. And I have to be honest, I don't know if I know the answer to that. So the gentleman could jump in. But what I will say is that in regards of reporting on sort of like the same thing over and over again, I mean, I think it just comes back to what we talked about earlier. Reporting and then getting sort of like the same response, right? Is that we don't know what we don't know. And so as organizations or media organizations or newsrooms or different things like that, I think there is sort of like what's the word that I'm trying to find? There's like solace in that. Like we should, stand up on that. Like we don't know. And so we're not going to pretend to know. So we're going to partner with folks that do know, that could help us get beyond, what really is the root of this issue, right? And so we can get that through partnerships, but also to, I think my team does a really good job of paying attention to trends, and looking at the sort of like the lay of the land, what is going on in the different parts of the country. And a lot of that is just creating those relationships with resources that you all have, which is this resource link to all of these different folks of different backgrounds and such that we could rely on. So that's what I would say to that. In order to get beyond sort of like the same mundane, is really just partnering with folks that know a little bit better than us, so they could, provide insight or lead us to someone that actually has the answer. And then we'll be able to use our platform to amplify that and share.
Awesome. Kelvin or John, do you want to add anything before we wrap?
Just pie in the sky. I would love to see the large media outlets within the state do a renters challenge where they actually try to, on a fixed income, find fair market rent within the county that they're based in. We have asked New Jersey legislators to do it before, I believe, and now she's Senator Brittany Timberlake, but she attempted to do it in her staff, I believe, and they could not find an affordable place to live on a fixed budget within the county they were in. It was very eye opening for them. So I think just to break through that, this only happens to other people, not me, really forcing some people to really, even if it's for a week or two, try to walk in those shoes.
I love that. It's like a simulator. Have you seen the poverty simulators that some of the nonprofit organizations are doing, where they're partnering with corporations and folks of affluent communities and putting them through a poverty simulation? I've actually did one where you can actually experience and you realize that the things that we judge, we're not in the position to judge anymore. And we realize, that poverty is a little bit more closer than what we thought. But anyhow, I love that idea. Actually, I might take that back to my team. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, Cassandra, do you want to close us out? We're right at the top of the hour, and I see we've got other folks jumping in for, I think, another meeting after this. Do you want to come up and close us out? Thank you both. Thank you all three of you for doing this. This has been fantastic. And like I said, we can keep going for another hour. But Cassandra, I'll let you close us out, and we appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So yeah, we'll have to leave it here, but what an awesome and informative conversation. Thanks to everyone for participating in today's panel about the housing crisis in New Jersey. A very special thanks to our host, Schlonn Hawkins, and panelists Kelvin Bodie and Professor John Robinson III, for sharing their time and insights with us. Please look out for event materials, including a list of experts from the diverse sources database, and a transcript and recording from today's session.